Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to do a recommendations video, but also sort of a discussion. So today I want to talk about 4 of my favorite books of all time, and the sort of storytelling device that they all have in common. So I'm going to recommend them, I'm going to talk about them more, but I'm also going to explain why it is that I think I love this framing device and what about it works so well for me. So, 4 of my favorite books. We're going to talk about The Color Purple by Alice Walker, Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fannie Flagg, The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield, and The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I have wanted to talk about this for actual months. I think the first time I started thinking about making a video was back at the beginning of 2018. The thing that all 4 of these books have in common is that every single one of them, the framing device is that one woman is telling her story to another woman. This is something I realized back when I started reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, so I'm going to talk about that one first, kind of introduce the book to you. So this book is about an aging starlet from the golden age of Hollywood, Evelyn Hugo. In her old age, Evelyn invites a relatively unknown journalist named Monique Grant to sort of tell her life story. It's gonna be the first time she has ever come clean about her past, talked about her legendary 7 husbands, how she got to be the star that she was. The book is written in a fairly predictable format, first introducing Monique and then slowly introducing Evelyn Hugo as she tells Monique her life story. There are a few breaks in the middle of these like big chunks of Evelyn's story as you get to know more the relationship between Evelyn and Monique. Both of them are remarkably bold women, they're both multifaceted women, and as you get to know Evelyn more and more, you get to understand the various decisions she has made over her life, whether they be good or bad. So the reason I noticed this storytelling device for the first time is that whenever I would describe it, it is a remarkably similar introduction to a story as The 13th Tale. The 13th Tale is a book that I read back in high school, so while Evelyn Hugo is the newest book I read with this trope, The 13th Tale is the oldest that I can remember. Like Evelyn Hugo, this book is about a reclusive, famous woman, in this case Vida Winter, who is famous for writing a collection of fairy tales. And like that book, she invites a relatively unknown biographer to her home to hear her story and to later write the book about her. Margaret, like Monique, remains very suspicious of Vida's motivations throughout the entire duration of the novel, but she stays there because she's curious why she was chosen for this job and because there is some secret about her past, answers that she has been searching for, and she thinks Vida might possibly have those answers. This is one of my favorite literary stories, by the way, because it is one of the most bookish books I have ever read. It is about writers and readers and books and the love of reading and the mysteries that are held between pages. So these 2 books are, at the most surface level, very similar. Before I ever read Evelyn Hugo, I constantly compared it to The 13th Tale because they have that sort of same framing device. But it's because of this framing device that you get 2 such drastically different stories. Because of how deeply intertwined these stories are of these 2 women in each case, you get a really nuanced understanding of all 4 of these women. And before we go any further, let me quickly talk about the other 2 books I wanted to mention. So first, of course, The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is a book, it starts in the early 20th century in the South, and it follows Celie for her entire life, basically. It begins in her childhood, where she was raised alongside her sister by her abusive stepfather. She is later married off to a man who also mistreats her. He's also a much older man. And then it eventually follows her into her life where she finds a family that loves her and is allowed to embrace the truest version of herself that's kind of always existed, but she's always hidden away. This book makes the list because I wrote about it in my Women's and Gender Studies English crossover, like, thesis that I wrote when I graduated college. It's something that I wrote about in my feminist history-based thesis. So this book begins with the line, "Dear God," because in her youth, Celie addresses everything, all of her writing, to God as though she's writing a letter. But as the story goes on, Celie starts to see God as a very male figure. She starts to lump him in with the other men in her life who have mistreated her because she has always been mistreated by men. So because men have only ever been cruel to her, she slowly loses her faith in God, and about halfway through the book stops addressing her letters to him and starts addressing them to Nellie, her sister. So Nellie was taken away from Celie when they were still very young, but despite that, Celie's letters being addressed to Nellie are a very big turning point in the story. The moment that she sort of frees herself from the life that she has been living, the moment when she gets to declare, "I am here," when she admits her attraction to another woman, these are all developments that are marked by her starting to address her letters to a female figure instead of the male figure. And the last story that I want to summarize is, of course, Fried Green Tomatoes by Fannie Flagg. This is actually a story about 4 women, but it is still a story about storytelling between women. So very rightfully, in my opinion, this book begins in the 80s, and it follows a woman named Mrs. Threadgood, who is living at an old folks' home, meeting a woman named Evelyn. Evelyn is feeling very trapped, very slumped in middle age. She doesn't have a direction anymore, and she is at this old folks' home because her husband is visiting someone, and she happens to meet Mrs. Threadgood. They strike up a friendship, they find power in one another, and Evelyn also finds power in the stories that Mrs. Threadgood tells her about her youth in the South, in the small southern town of Whistlestop, and she is talking about 2 women that she knew in her youth, Ruth and Idgie. So Ruth and Idgie, their friendship, their relationship, everything about them sort of makes up the heart of this town. So it is a story of one woman telling a story to another woman, but she is telling the story of 2 women. It's very female-driven, this story. Plus, like The Color Purple and like Evelyn Hugo, this is a book about queer women. So that's 3 out of 4 of the books I've talked about are about queer women. So, why do all of my favorite books follow this trope? Why am I so drawn to it? I have, like, pages of notes for why, and we're gonna try to get through them all. First of all, I think it's because it enforces a female-centric narrative. When women tell stories about themselves, it puts female history at the center of a narrative, at the heart of a story. Evelyn Hugo is a story framed about her 7 husbands, but it is never once about them. It is a story about Evelyn at those different stages in her life, and the secrets that she kept as a bisexual Cuban woman at the golden age of Hollywood. The 13th tale is inherently about Margaret and Vida finding connection to one another in the things that they have both lost. The Color Purple is about Celie denying men the chance to ever hurt her again, and Fried Green Tomatoes is about the stories of women and how these stories empower other women despite different stages in life, despite different time periods. They find inspiration in one another, even if their stories are different. The books also each create a history and a past for women, specifically for queer women. The 13th tale is the only one not about queer women, but all 4 of them emphasize the past and the lives of the women telling their own stories. Often, stories of women in the past, women in history, those stories are pushed to the side, they are underemphasized, they are denied importance and forgotten. By enforcing the idea that women are allowed to tell their own stories, it also reinforces their importance in history. Even if they are living in a mansion away from the passing of time, if they are constantly in the public eye, they each get to tell their own stories of that time period on their own terms and from their own perspective. To put it another way, they shape male history in the way that men have been allowed to shape female history for centuries. Their lives are influenced by men, but they are not about men. The men in these stories are inconsequential compared to the complex internal lives of women. Because the complexities of women's internal lives are important, they've just been denied importance. Also, as I said, 3 of the 4 of these books are about queer women, and that is because female-centered narratives allow for so many different types of women to be in one another's lives. It allows different types of relationships to evolve. When stories aren't enforced in how they are about women, then sometimes those relationships can fall to the wayside. When they are constantly about the internal lives of women, it really pushes the importance of different types of relationships between women, especially in a book like Fried Green Tomatoes, where you have 4 different women and all of their stories are being told together. It's because of how female-centric that narrative is that you are allowed to see all of these different types of relationships between women and how nuanced each of those relationships are. These books reassert queer narratives in the 20th century, and not every book about women should be forced to do that, but I can't emphasize enough how important a history that is to enforce. Also, I want to take a minute to talk a bit more about my extra knowledge on The Color Purple, because this story is one I wanted to tell in that it is a story about a woman talking to another woman, but the real-life history of Alice Walker is incredibly important when you're talking about women uplifting other women's stories from history. So Alice Walker is the one who found the works of Zora Neale Hurston, who was another Black woman who wrote at the very beginning of the 20th century. Specifically, Alice Walker found Their Eyes Were Watching God and emphasized it enough and lifted it up enough that we now consider Zora Neale Hurston an essential author, an essential story that is told again. Alice Walker unearthed a piece of feminist history and made sure that we all remembered it, and that's especially telling in that Their Eyes Were Watching God is also a story about a woman telling her life story to another woman. The framing device of that book is a woman telling her life story to her friend Phoebe. So The Color Purple and Their Eyes Were Watching God are both essential ways of talking about this framing narrative because it is reflected in the real-life stories of Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston. I know that that was a bit of a tangent, but because I wrote my thesis on this book, it felt like an important thing to bring up when we're talking about women's stories and histories and all of the things I'm talking about. So these books are subjective, which I think is important to note, because they are always stories told by one woman about her life. They are framing their histories around how they will be received by the other woman. It means to a certain point that they are unreliable. So it shapes how we see the narrative in that they are unreliable, but it also enforces connection between women and how that connection influences the stories that are being told. And overall, that is the thing that all four of these books are about. They are about connection. I wrote about in my thesis that The Color Purple is about Celie finding a group of women who empower her. That book is about her finding a family on her own and how that family lifts her up. Mrs. Threadgood shows Evelyn a new way where she can be confident in herself, where she can stand up to her husband, where she can feel like herself again. Evelyn finds power in the stories of women who were also powerful and also took control of their own lives. Vida unlocks a piece of Margaret's history, allows her to understand a part of herself that she couldn't before. Monique finds rage within herself that she never knew existed, and it is because Evelyn showed her that path. None of these women are the same. In fact, they are incredibly different. But by sharing their stories, they all find a connection in one another, and they all allow each other to unlock a piece of their past that they couldn't have before. So I gotta tell you guys, planning out this video made me, like, this much long for the days of writing feminist papers, because it's been a while, and creating this video was very much, the scripting of it was like writing a draft for a paper I would have turned in. I think that that was even more emphasized because I wanted to talk about The Color Purple and because I had to research so much and dissect every part of The Color Purple for my thesis. If I had still been in college, these four books would have been what my thesis was about. This is what I would have written about instead of some of the other books I wrote about. So, if you haven't read any of these four books, I highly encourage you to. They're all magnificent books that I've talked about many, many, many times before. You should read them. But also, I just really wanted to talk about how these stories are written and why it is that I love them, because I think that it's important to notice the things about our favorite stories, the things they have in common, and why those things are important. I just said important twice. That was a disaster of a sentence. See, this is why I scripted the rest of this video. My thesis was about feminist history and how fiction sort of was shaped by feminism and how feminism shaped literature. So finding books about women telling their own stories, about them emphasizing their own history, it just struck a chord with me and I wanted to talk about it more. But that is it. That is all I wanted to talk about with this video. I hope you enjoyed hearing some of my long-winded thoughts about these books. I hope that if you haven't read any of them, you decide to pick them up. Let me know if you liked this video down in the comments below and I might do more like it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!